This is the chilling case of Ryan Thompson, a Canadian husband, and Priya Sharma, his Indian bride, whose cross-cultural marriage began as a love story but ended in a shocking basement murder. What seemed like a dream turned into a nightmare hidden beneath concrete walls. Before we dive into the full story, make sure you support this channel by subscribing and staying active so you never miss more true crime cases like this one. Ryan Thompson was the kind of man people often described as steady. He had worked in construction most of his life, saving enough to buy a modest home in Ontario after his divorce left him starting over. At 34, he wasn't looking for another heartbreak, but he also wasn't ready to live the rest of his life alone. His evenings were quiet, filled with long hours scrolling through his phone. That was how he came across Priya Sharma's profile. She lived in India, and her smile stood out immediately. Their first exchanges were light, the kind of casual messages that don't seem important at the time. But Ryan kept returning to her page, and soon the small conversations stretched into hours. Priya was 7 years younger, raised in a close-knit family in Delhi. She had grown up surrounded by noise, color, and tradition. For her, the idea of leaving for Canada was both terrifying and exciting. Ryan seemed stable and safe compared to men she had known before. He promised her a future where she could grow, explore, and live differently. That promise carried weight, especially as her family began encouraging the connection. Within months, Ryan had booked a flight, and the meeting that followed confirmed what both had already started to believe, that this was more than a passing friendship. The visit was quick but meaningful. Ryan attended family dinners, learned a few phrases in Hindi, and won over Priya's relatives with his sincerity. By the time he returned to Canada, wedding plans were already in motion. For Ryan, it was a chance to rebuild the life he had lost after his divorce. For Priya, it was the leap into an unknown world, one that looked full of opportunity. To their friends, it looked like destiny. To them, it felt like the beginning of forever. The wedding was a grand celebration in Delhi, full of music, dancing, and endless meals shared among relatives. Ryan stood out in his formal attire, trying his best to follow the customs, while Priya glowed in traditional dress, surrounded by the laughter of cousins and friends. The photographs captured a fairy tale image of love between two people from very different worlds. Yet, once the celebrations were over and the honeymoon phase passed, reality began to settle in. When Priya boarded the plane to Canada, leaving her family behind, she was filled with excitement, but also an unspoken fear of what her new life would actually feel like. The arrival in Ontario was not as she had imagined. The small suburban neighborhood where Ryan lived was quiet to the point of silence. Priya had been used to bustling streets, crowded markets, and the constant chatter of family around her. In Canada, she spent long stretches of the day alone while Ryan worked. She found herself staring out the window, watching cars pass by, or flipping through television channels she didn't understand. The walls of the house felt closer each week, and the distance from her family weighed heavily on her. Ryan believed he was giving Priya stability, but she interpreted it as isolation. He encouraged her to learn English faster, to adapt, and to focus on building a household, but the pressure left her feeling inadequate. She had expected Canada to feel modern and exciting, yet much of her time was spent inside, cooking and cleaning, with little exposure to the new world she had hoped to explore. Friends of Ryan noticed her absence at gatherings and asked about her, but he brushed it off as adjustment time. Beneath the surface, the marriage was already struggling to balance love with the challenges of two completely different worlds colliding. By the third month of living together, the atmosphere inside the Thompson home had changed. The warmth and excitement of their early days were replaced with tension that grew heavier with each argument. Ryan, once patient and affectionate, became more controlling. He began monitoring Priya's calls to her family, questioning why she needed to speak with them so often. He expected her to focus on their new life together. But to Priya, those conversations were her only connection to home and the life she had left behind. The pressure to keep her feelings hidden grew stronger, and she began to internalize the loneliness that followed her through every day. Neighbors started to notice the strain, even without knowing the details. Late at night, Voices would rise inside the house, the sound of shouting muffled by walls, but still noticeable in the quiet neighborhood. A few times, the arguments spilled out into the driveway, though Ryan would quickly retreat back inside once he realized people could hear. For Priya, these moments of conflict became overwhelming. She began to confide in a women's support group she discovered at a nearby community center. To them, she admitted that her husband's temper scared her. She never described outright violence, but the implication lingered. Ryan's friends also saw changes in him. He stopped joining them for drinks after work, turning down invitations he would have once accepted. When pressed, he claimed he was busy with home projects, but they sensed a distance he didn't explain. Priya, on the other hand, grew more withdrawn. She avoided eye contact when neighbors greeted her and often seemed hurried, as though she wanted to escape interaction. The cracks in their marriage were no longer hidden. What had once been portrayed as a cross-cultural love story now resembled a fragile bond under the weight of resentment, mistrust, and growing fear. The basement became Ryan's obsession. What had started as a simple renovation project slowly grew into something that consumed his evenings and weekends. He told friends he was creating a family entertainment space with a home theater, a bar, and a lounge area where they could host gatherings. But Priya never shared his enthusiasm. She disliked the basement, describing it as dark and unsettling. The unfinished concrete walls, exposed wires, and constant smell of dampness made her feel uneasy, yet Ryan insisted it would soon become the heart of their home. As the weeks passed, Ryan began spending more and more time downstairs, sometimes late into the night. Priya would hear the sharp buzz of power tools, hammering that echoed through the floors, and drilling at hours that disturbed the peace of their quiet street. Neighbors later remembered these sounds and thought it odd, but at the time, they assumed he was just a dedicated handyman. What seemed harmless on the surface carried a much more troubling undertone. Ryan wasn't simply renovating. He was altering the basement in ways that raised questions later, such as adding thick insulation and soundproofing. Priya confided to the women's group that she hated the space. She mentioned how he was secretive about what he was doing and never asked for her opinion. She even joked that she was afraid of the basement, though beneath her smile there was a hint of something genuine. Her words went unnoticed, dismissed as casual remarks. To Ryan, the basement symbolized control, a place he could shape without anyone interfering. To Priya, it symbolized distance and secrecy. The project that should have represented building a home together instead became a dividing line, foreshadowing the darkness that would soon engulf their marriage. The morning Ryan walked into the police station to report Priya missing, his calm demeanor caught the attention of officers immediately. He explained that after another argument, Priya had packed a small bag and stormed out of the house late at night. He suggested she might have gone to stay with friends or even considered returning to India. On the surface, it was a plausible story, but investigators noticed gaps in his account. Why would she leave without her passport? Why were her credit cards, winter coat, and even her shoes still neatly placed inside the house? The February cold in Ontario was brutal, and walking out into the night without proper clothing seemed unlikely. At first, the case was handled as a missing person report, and volunteers began searching nearby areas. Flyers were posted, and Priya's picture appeared on local news broadcasts. Members of her women's support group came forward, telling police about her concerns with Ryan's temper. These details painted a more troubling picture than Ryan had described. Meanwhile, Ryan continued to maintain that Priya had simply left, telling neighbors he was heartbroken but hopeful she would return. His calmness, however, came across as strangely detached. Detectives began to look more closely at Ryan himself. His phone records showed no attempts to contact Priya after she disappeared. Surveillance footage from nearby streets showed no trace of her leaving the house. Even her social media activity had gone silent the exact day Ryan claimed she walked away. Step by step, the idea that she had voluntarily vanished grew harder to believe. Suspicion turned inward toward the very house Ryan insisted she had left. Investigators requested a full search of the property, knowing something about his story didn't add up. The quiet suburban home was about to reveal its secrets. When investigators entered Ryan's basement during the search, they immediately noticed something unusual. Certain sections of the concrete floor looked different from the rest, patches of fresh cement that stood out against the older, worn surface. Ryan brushed it off as part of his ongoing renovation work, claiming he had been fixing cracks. But detectives, already suspicious of his story, decided to take a closer look. The smell of chemicals and the odd placement of construction tools only heightened their concern. To confirm their suspicions, they brought in cadaver dogs, and the animals quickly alerted to the very spots Ryan had tried to dismiss. That single reaction shifted the investigation from a missing person case to something much darker. Officers broke through the cement layer, their tools cutting into the floor Ryan had poured with such care. Beneath the hardened surface, they uncovered a horrifying discovery. Wrapped tightly in a blanket, Priya's body had been concealed in the basement where Ryan had spent countless hours. The careful planning of sealing her beneath concrete revealed a disturbing level of calculation. She had not vanished into the night as Ryan claimed. She had been silenced and hidden within the very house she once dreamed of making her home. The scene shocked even seasoned investigators. Every detail of Ryan's renovation suddenly looked sinister. The soundproofing, the insulation, the late-night drilling. It was no longer the work of a man improving his property, but the actions of someone preparing a hiding place. As word spread, neighbors who had once thought of Ryan as quiet and polite were horrified. The truth was undeniable, and the search for a missing woman had ended with the grim reality of a body buried under concrete. Priya's fate had been sealed in the basement Ryan had built around his darkest secret. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to piece together the final hours of Priya's life. The autopsy revealed that she had died from blunt force trauma, a violent blow to the head that left no chance of survival. The evidence pointed to a heated confrontation that had spiraled out of control, but investigators also noticed signs suggesting this wasn't just a crime of sudden rage. The basement preparations, the cement work, and the soundproofing hinted at planning that stretched back weeks, maybe even months. Ryan had presented himself as a man trying to build a new life with his wife, yet beneath the surface he seemed to be building a cover for something far more sinister. As the case unfolded in court, prosecutors laid out a chilling narrative. They described Ryan as a man who craved control, and when Priya resisted or longed for the independence he tried to deny her, his frustration grew into violence. Witnesses from her women's support group testified about her fears, recalling how she had mentioned his temper and her unease about the basement. Neighbors recounted the arguments they had overheard, while Ryan's friends admitted they had noticed his growing isolation. Each testimony chipped away at the image he had tried to maintain as a devoted husband abandoned by a runaway wife. The defense argued that the killing was unplanned, the tragic result of an argument that escalated too far. But the physical evidence contradicted that story. The soundproofing, the freshly poured cement, and the attempt to bury her under the basement floor suggested intent, not impulse. The jury was left to weigh whether Ryan's actions were born of sudden rage or careful calculation. Either way, the truth was undeniable. Priya's trust in him had cost her everything, and his carefully crafted mask of normalcy had finally cracked. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict, there was little surprise in the courtroom. Ryan Thompson was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for many years. The prosecutors emphasized how Priya had crossed continents in the hope of building a future, only to find herself trapped in a marriage that turned into a nightmare. Her story struck a deep chord with the public, especially within immigrant communities, where many women faced the daunting challenge of leaving behind familiar surroundings and adjusting to a new country. Priya's tragedy became a painful reminder of how isolation and vulnerability can place someone in unimaginable danger. Her family in India was devastated. They had trusted Ryan, believing he would protect and cherish their daughter. Instead, they received news no parent could ever prepare for, that their daughter's life had been stolen, hidden beneath a concrete floor thousands of miles from home. Vigils were held both in Canada and India, with community members lighting candles and praying for her soul. People who had never known Priya felt connected to her story, moved by the cruel contrast between her hopeful beginning and the way her life ended. In the quiet neighborhood where the crime took place, the house stood as a grim reminder of what had happened. Neighbors who once waved to Ryan now struggled to reconcile their memories of him with the horror uncovered in his basement. The case was featured in documentaries and articles, serving as a cautionary tale of love, control, and the hidden dangers inside seemingly ordinary lives. Priya's story, though tragic, shed light on the importance of listening to subtle cries for help and recognizing the red flags in relationships. Her life ended in silence, but her story continues to speak loudly, warning others never to ignore the signs.